My hands were already on his face before I realized what I'd done. Around us, the world stopped. The clicking of safeties being switched off echoed through the marble hall as the guards reached for their guns. No one touches the Dragon of Seoul. Not if they want to live. In this house, he wasn't just a CEO, he was a god with a tattooed throat and a heart of ice. But I didn't care anymore. The fear that had kept me quiet for 24 years had finally burned out, leaving nothing but a cold, hard coal of defiance. "Look at me," I shouted, my fingers digging into his pale, smooth skin, forcing him to meet my gaze. The most feared man in the city, a man who had ordered executions with a casual wave of his hand, just stared at me. He didn't pull away. He didn't strike me. He looked shocked, his dark brown eyes widening as they searched mine, finding a fire he clearly hadn't expected from a girl in a maid's uniform. That was the moment everything changed. That was the moment the predator became the prey. Because 3 hours earlier, I wasn't a rebel. I was a daughter whose father had just gambled away her life to settle a $5 million debt. 3 hours earlier, I'd been sold like a piece of livestock, and I was still wearing the bruises from the struggle to prove it. The silence in the grand hall was heavy, thick enough to choke the air out of my lungs. My fingers were still pressed against the cool, pale skin of his jaw, and I could feel the slight tremor of his pulse beneath my touch. It was the heartbeat of a man who held the city in his palm. Yet in this moment, it felt remarkably human. The guards didn't fire. They stood like statues of lead, their eyes darting toward their master, waiting for the single nod that would end my life. I didn't blink. I kept my gaze locked on his, searching for the monster everyone whispered about. Instead, I saw a reflection of my own defiance, hidden deep behind those dark, narrow eyes. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, his lips parted. He didn't roar. He didn't strike me. Instead, he reached up, his large hand moving with the grace of a predator. I braced for the impact, for the grip that would throw me to the floor. But his fingers only brushed against the white collar of my maid's uniform, his thumb tracing the line of my throat. "You have very loud eyes for someone so small," he whispered. His voice was a low, melodic vibration that seemed to hum through my own skin. He looked past me then, his gaze sharpening into twin blades as it landed on Secretary Kim. The older man was trembling so violently that his glasses were slipping down his nose. "Kim," the CEO said, his voice returning to its usual sub-zero temperature. "Why is this woman wearing the uniform of the general kitchen staff?" Kim stammered, his words tripping over each other. "Sir, her father's dead. She was assigned to the heavy cleaning rotation. She's just a common maid, a nobody." "She is no longer a nobody," he interrupted, his hand finally dropping from my face, though the heat of it lingered like a brand. "The general staff is forbidden from the third floor. From this moment on, she is my personal attendant. She alone will maintain my study. If I see another soul on that floor without my express invitation, you won't live long enough to apologize." A collective gasp rippled through the hall. The third floor was a sanctuary, a place where the dragon's secrets were kept under lock and key. Even Kim wasn't permitted there without a direct summons. To put a girl from the slums who had just physically assaulted the boss, in that position was unheard of. It wasn't a promotion, it was a sentence, or an obsession. "Follow me," he commanded. He didn't wait for an answer. He turned on his heel, his black suit jacket fluttering like the wings of a dark bird. I stood there for a heartbeat, my legs feeling like water. I looked at the guards, who were slowly holstering their weapons with confused, frustrated expressions. I looked at Kim, whose face had turned a sickly shade of purple. I knew then that I hadn't just survived. I'd stepped into a much more dangerous cage. I followed him up the spiraling marble staircase, the sounds of the house fading away until there was only the rhythmic click of his shoes and the soft patter of my own. We reached the third floor, a hallway lined with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the glittering, rainy skyline of Seoul. At the very end stood a pair of heavy mahogany doors. He pushed them open and stepped into a room that smelled of old paper, expensive tobacco, and a faint, metallic scent that made my hair stand on end. The study was vast, filled with leather-bound books and flickering monitors displaying scrolling lines of code and security feeds. He walked over to a massive desk carved from a single piece of dark wood and sat down, leaning back into the leather chair. He watched me as I stood awkwardly by the door, my hands clasped in front of my apron. "You're wondering why you aren't dead," he said, his eyes tracking the way my chest rose and fell with my jagged breathing. The thought crossed my mind. I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. "Most people look at me and see a title. They see a bank account or a body count," he said, tilting his head. He looked at the ink rising from his collar, the dragon's tail curling toward his ear. "You looked at me and saw a man. You dared to touch the skin beneath the ink. That makes you either very brave or very stupid. I haven't decided which yet." He leaned forward, the light from the desk lamp casting long, sharp shadows across his angular face. "This room is my mind, Isabelle. Everything in here is a part of me. You will clean it. You will organize it. You will be here whenever I am here. And most importantly, you will never touch me again unless I tell you to." I felt a shiver run down my spine, but it wasn't just fear. It was the weight of his attention, a heavy, suffocating focus that made it feel as though we were the only two people left in the world. "And my sister?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "My father said her surgery would be paid for. The debt is settled," he said, his gaze dropping to my lips for a fleeting second before returning to my eyes. "The hospital has already received the wire transfer. Her life is bought and paid for, which means your life belongs entirely to me." He picked up a silver pen, the movement final. "There is a bucket and a cloth in the corner. Start with the windows. I want to be able to see the city clearly when the sun comes up." As I turned to do as he asked, I could feel his eyes on my back. I realized then that while I had grabbed his face to demand my humanity, I had inadvertently handed him my soul. I was no longer a maid in a house of hundreds. I was a prisoner in a room of one. And as I looked at the dark, tattooed man silhouetted against the city lights, I realized the most terrifying part of all. I didn't want to leave. The rain continued to lash against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the third floor, a relentless drumming that matched the frantic rhythm of my heart. 2 weeks had passed since I was moved into the dragon's inner sanctum, and in that time, the world outside had ceased to exist. My life was measured in the silence of his study, the weight of his unyielding gaze, and the meticulous care I took in cleaning every inch of his mahogany desk. But tonight, the silence was broken. The heavy doors swung open with a violent thud. I dropped my cleaning cloth, spinning around to see Hyun-jong stumbling into the room. He wasn't alone. Secretary Kim was hovering behind him, his face a mask of terror. Hyun-jong's black suit jacket was gone, his white silk shirt torn at the shoulder and blooming with a deep, angry crimson. "Out!" Hyun-jong hissed, his voice a jagged edge of pain. "But CEO, the doctor is on his way." I said out. Hyun-jong roared, leaning heavily against the edge of the desk. Kim vanished instantly, the doors clicking shut with a finality that left me trapped in the room with a wounded predator. I stood frozen as Hyun-jong fumbled with the buttons of his shirt, his breathing shallow and hitched. He hissed through his teeth, his fingers slick with blood, unable to manage the fabric. Without thinking, driven by the same reckless impulse that had made me grab his face, I moved toward him. "Let me?" I whispered. He froze, his dark eyes snapping to mine. For a second, I thought he would cast me out, but the exhaustion won. He slumped slightly, allowing his hands to fall to his sides. With trembling fingers, I began to undo the remaining buttons. As the silk parted, the full extent of the dragon was revealed. The black ink was breathtaking up close, intricate scales and fierce claws that seemed to breathe with every rise and fall of his chest. But as I peeled the blood-soaked fabric away from his shoulder, my breath caught in my throat. The tattoos weren't just art. They were a shroud. Beneath the elegant curves of the dragon's wings lay a map of horror. Jagged, silvery lines of old scar tissue sliced through the ink. Some were thin and precise, like the marks of a blade. Others were thick and uneven, the remnants of burns that the tattooist had tried desperately to camouflage with floral patterns and shading. The dragon didn't just sit on his skin. It struggled to hold his broken body together. "You're staring," he murmured, his head lolling back as he fought the pain. "Who did this to you?" I asked, my voice cracking. I reached for a basin of warm water and a clean cloth, beginning to dab away the fresh blood from the shallow graze on his shoulder. He let out a dry, humorless laugh that sounded more like a cough. "Family, rivals, the people who supposedly loved me, and the people who wanted to be me. In my world, Isabelle, love is just a weapon you haven't been stabbed with yet." I looked at a particularly deep scar that ran from his collarbone down toward his heart, partially hidden by the dragon's head. It looked old, older than his time as CEO. "This one, you were a child." Hyun-jong's eyes fluttered shut, his jaw tightening. My father's way of ensuring I never forgot the price of weakness. He told me that if I couldn't endure the flame, I didn't deserve the throne. A wave of nausea rolled over me, followed by a fierce, protective heat. I realized then that the dragon of Seoul wasn't a monster born of malice. He was a masterpiece of survival. Every cold command, every violent outburst, was a brick in the wall he had built to protect the boy who had been broken long before the world knew his name. I rinsed the cloth, the water turning a pale pink. As I worked, the silence shifted. It was no longer the heavy, suffocating tension of a master and a servant. It was the quiet of two damaged souls standing in the dark. "Is that why you don't let anyone touch you?" I asked softly, moving the cloth to the edge of the tattoo. Hyun-jong opened his eyes. They weren't cold anymore. They were wide, vulnerable, and filled with a longing so sharp it hurt to look at. Touch is a vulnerability. If someone can get close enough to stroke your skin, they're close enough to slip a knife between your ribs. He reached out, his hand hovering near my waist before he pulled back, as if remembering the rules he had set. But I didn't pull away. I leaned in, my shadow merging with his on the mahogany walls. "I don't have a knife." "Hyun-jong," I said, using his name for the first time. The sound of it seemed to startle him. He looked at me, truly looked at me, and for a fleeting second, the CEO vanished. There was only a man, covered in ink and scars. Reaching for something he had been taught was a myth. "No," he whispered, his hand finally settling on my cheek, his thumb brushing against my skin with a tenderness that shattered my heart. "You have something much more dangerous." He leaned his forehead against mine, his scent, sandalwood and iron, filling my senses. The rain continued to drum against the glass, but inside the study, the fire was just beginning to burn. I realized then that I wasn't just cleaning his room or attending his wounds. I was becoming the only person allowed to see the man beneath the monster, and in the world of the Mafia, that was the most dangerous position of all. I looked at the dragon on his chest, its eyes fierce and protective. I understood now. The ink wasn't for show. It was a guardian. And as he pulled me a fraction of an inch closer, I knew that from this night on, the dragon wouldn't just be guarding his own secrets. He would be guarding me. The weight of his confession hung in the air, more suffocating than the smoke that often filled this room. For the first time, the dragon looked less like a legend and more like a man who had been set on fire and told to call it a crown. But the piece of the third floor was a lie. The world below was already moving to tear us apart. The morning brought a deceptive calm. The rain had stopped, leaving Seoul scrubbed clean and glistening under a pale, gray sky. In the study, The only sound was the scratch of a fountain pen and the soft rustle of my uniform as I shelved books that had been disturbed during the previous night's chaos. Hyun Jong sat at his desk, his white shirt buttoned to the chin, hiding the blood, the bandages, and the history written in his skin. He hadn't spoken to me since he'd leaned his forehead against mine, but his eyes followed me. Every time I moved, I could feel the tether between us tightening. A sharp knock at the door broke the tension. Secretary Kim entered, followed by a man I didn't recognize, a sleek, smiling individual in a silver suit that looked like sharkskin. CEO, huh? The man said, his voice dripping with false professional courtesy. I am Director Nam from the Jinho Group. My chairman sends his regards and a small token of appreciation for your recovery after last night's unfortunate street incident. He placed a black lacquer box on the desk. Hyun Jong didn't look at the box. He didn't even look at Nam. He looked at me. Isabelle, Hyun Jong said, his voice a low, smooth command. Take the director to the kitchen. He seems to have forgotten that we don't accept tokens from men who hire amateurs to shoot at me in the ring. Nam's smile didn't falter, but his eyes turned cold. As I led him toward the elevators, the air felt electric, charged with a threat I couldn't name. Once we were inside the gold-plated lift, Nam turned to me. He didn't see a woman. He saw a tool. You're the one everyone is talking about, Nam whispered, leaning in so close I could smell the expensive, cloying mint on his breath. The maid who touched the untouchable. Tell me, Isabelle, how much is your sister's life worth today? I froze. The elevator felt smaller, the walls closing in. How do you know about my sister? We know everything, he said, pulling a small, translucent vial from his pocket. It was filled with a clear, odorless liquid. This is a specialized sedative. Not lethal, just enough to put the CEO into a deep sleep for an hour. If he sleeps, certain files can be copied. If those files are copied, your sister gets the best specialists in the world. And you get to walk out of this den of monsters with more money than your father could gamble away in 10 lifetimes. He pressed the vial into my palm. Think about it. He bought you. He treats you like property. Why protect a man who doesn't even know your middle name? The elevator doors opened. I walked him to the gate in a daze, the vial burning a hole in my hand. When I returned to the third floor, Hyun Jong was standing by the window, his back to me. The study was bathed in the orange glow of the setting sun. I stood by the tea service, my fingers trembling as I reached for his porcelain cup. The vial was hidden in the folds of my apron. All I had to do was pour. 1 hour of sleep. 1 hour to save Maya forever. I looked at his reflection in the glass. He looked lonely. He looked like the boy who had been burned by his own father. He looked like the man who had held my hand with a tenderness that made me want to cry. I picked up the cup and walked toward him. He turned, his gaze dropping to the cup, then to my face. He knew. He had cameras in the elevators. He had microphones in the halls. This was the test. He was waiting to see if I was just another knife between his ribs. I stopped inches from him. My heart was a drum in my ears. Slowly, I reached into my apron. I pulled out the vial and held it up between us, the liquid catching the sunset like a diamond. Director Nam forgot this, I said, my voice unwavering. With a sudden, sharp motion, I dropped the vial. It shattered against the marble floor, the clear liquid pooling among the shards. The silence that followed was different from before. It wasn't heavy or dark. It was crystalline. Hyun Jong looked down at the broken glass, then back at me. A slow, genuine shadow of a smile touched his lips, a look so rare it felt like a gift. He offered you your freedom, Hyun Jong said softly. I've been free since I grabbed your face, I replied. I'm not here because of a debt anymore. Hyun Jong stepped over the glass. He didn't hesitate this time. He reached out and tucked a loose strand of my curly hair behind my ear, his fingers lingering on the gold stud in my lobe. The Jinho Group will move faster now, he warned, his voice dropped to a private whisper. They know I have a heart, and they know exactly where it is kept. He leaned down, his lips brushing against my temple. Tonight, we don't work. Tonight, you aren't the maid. I'm taking you somewhere where the ink and the debt don't matter. I didn't know then that the gala he was taking me to was a trap designed by Jin Ho. I only knew that for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of the dragon. I was afraid of the world that wanted to take him from me. The air in the study felt different now. Thicker, charged with a promise that had nothing to do with contracts or debts. As I looked at the broken glass on the floor, I realized I had just traded my safety for something far more volatile. I didn't recognize the woman in the mirror. Han Jong had sent a team to my small quarters. Not guards, but tailors and stylists who moved with the silent efficiency of his soldiers. They had replaced my starch-white maid's collar with a floor-length gown of midnight blue silk that hugged my curves and glowed against my deep brown skin. My natural curls were pinned back, adorned with a single diamond clip that cost more than my father's house. When I stepped back into the study, Han Jong was waiting. He was dressed in a charcoal tuxedo, his white shirt crisp against the black ink that still peeked out from his collar. When he saw me, he didn't speak. He simply stood, his dark eyes tracing the transformation from maid to equal. "You look like a queen," he said, his voice a low vibration. "But tonight, you must act like a shield. The Blue House Gala is a nest of vipers. Stay close to me. Do not take a drink from anyone but my own staff." "Is this why you're taking me?" I asked, my voice trembling as he offered his arm. "To show them you have a heart?" "No," he whispered, leaning down so his lips brushed my ear. "To show them that anyone who touches what is mine will face the dragon." The gala was a blur of flashbulbs and forced smiles. The elite of Seoul moved through the ballroom like sharks in a gilded tank. Every head turned as we entered. The whispers were like a physical weight. The Mafia king and his black Cinderella. I felt the heat of 1,000 judgments, but every time I faltered, I felt the firm pressure of Han Jong's hand on the small of my back, guiding me, claiming me. But then, he was pulled away by a group of high-ranking officials. 10 minutes, he promised, his eyes lingering on mine. "Don't move from this balcony." I watched him go, feeling suddenly exposed in the sea of silk and lace. A beautiful dress doesn't change the scent of poverty, does it? I turned to see a woman standing in the shadows of the balcony. She was elegant, her skin as pale as porcelain, wearing a gown of blood-red lace. Lady Madeline. I recognized her from the files I'd organized, the woman the syndicate had intended for Han Jong before I arrived. "I'm not here to discuss my background," I said, my sharp, focused gaze narrowing. "You're here as bait, Isabelle," she sneered, stepping into the light. "Han Jong thinks he's protecting you, but he's just made you a target. Look around." I looked. Near the bar, I saw Director Nam. Beside him stood a man with a scarred face and cold, dead eyes. Jin Ho, the rival chairman. He wasn't looking at the officials. He was looking at me. "Han Jong's paranoia is his greatest strength," Madeline whispered, leaning in. "But his love for you is his greatest weakness. Jin Ho doesn't need to kill the dragon to win. He just needs to make the dragon think you've betrayed him again." Before I could respond, a waiter approached with 2 glasses of champagne. Madeline took one and pushed the other toward me. "A toast? To the girl who thinks she can tame a monster." I remembered Han Jong's warning. "Do not take a drink from anyone." "I'm not thirsty," I said, stepping back. Madeline's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. She set her glass down and leaned closer, her voice a venomous hiss. "It doesn't matter if you drink or not. The seeds are already planted. Look at your hand, Isabelle." I looked down. My diamond ring, the one Han Jong had placed on my finger an hour ago, was gone. In its place was a small, silver flash drive that hadn't been there a moment ago. "He's coming," she whispered, backing away into the crowd. I looked up to see Han Jong walking toward me, his face tight with concern. He saw my hand. He saw the silver drive, glinting in the light. "Isabelle?" he asked, his voice losing its warmth, turning back into the ice I had worked so hard to melt. "What is that?" The trap had snapped shut. Jin Ho was across the room, raising a glass in a silent toast. He didn't need to steal the files. He just needed Hyunjong to see me holding the evidence of a betrayal I hadn't committed. It's not what it looks like, I started, but the guard were already moving in, and the dragon's eyes were turning back to stone. The air in the ballroom, once filled with the scent of expensive perfume and champagne, suddenly felt as thin and cold as a mountain peak. Hyunjong stood before me, his shadow stretching long across the polished floor. The diamond clip in my hair felt like a lead weight, and the small, silver flash drive in my palm felt like a live coal. Hyunjong didn't shout. He didn't reach for a weapon. He simply looked at my hand, his jaw tightening until the dragon on his neck seemed to shift, its inked scales tensing. The warmth I'd spent weeks coaxing out of him vanished in an instant, replaced by the terrifying, robotic stillness of the CEO. "Isabelle," he said, his voice a low, dangerous whisper that carried more weight than a scream. "What are you holding?" "Hyunjong, listen to me," I pleaded, my voice trembling. "A woman. She was just here. Madeline. She put this in my hand. I didn't take it. I didn't ask for it." Across the room, the music continued to play, a Johnny waltz that mocked the destruction of my life. I saw Jin-ho leaning against a marble pillar, his scarred face illuminated by a smirk as he watched the dragon begin to coil. Hyunjong stepped closer, his scent of sandalwood and iron now undercut by the sharp smell of ozone. He took the flash drive from my fingers. His touch wasn't tender this time. It was clinical cold. "Secretary Kim," he said, not breaking eye contact with me. Kim appeared from the shadows, his face pale, but his eyes gleaming with a triumphant, "I told you so" light. "Yes, CEO. Take her back to the estate. Lock the third floor. No one goes in, and she doesn't come out until I have decrypted this." "Hyunjong, please." I reached for his arm, but he flinched away as if my touch were acid. The rejection stung worse than any physical blow. "It's a trap. Jin-ho is watching us right now. He wants you to doubt me." Hyunjong finally looked away from me, his gaze landing on Jin-ho across the room. His expression was unreadable, a mask of stone. "If you are telling the truth, Isabelle, you have nothing to fear. But if this drive contains the ledger of my offshore holdings, then you have everything to lose." The ride back to the mansion was a nightmare of silence. Kim sat in the front, his back stiff with smug satisfaction. I sat in the back of the black sedan, staring at my reflection in the window. The midnight blue silk gown looked like a funeral shroud now. I had gone from a maid to a queen, and back to a prisoner in the span of 4 hours. Back at the estate, the guards didn't look at me. They were the same men who had seen me grab the CEO's face, the same men who had started to nod to me in hallways. Now, they looked through me. I was escorted to the third floor. The mahogany doors to the study, which had become a place of safety and whispered secrets, were now my cell. I heard the heavy click of the electronic lock engaging. Hours bled into the night. I paced the room, the silk of my dress rustling against the books and monitors. I looked at the desk where we had shared that quiet moment after his injury. I looked at the floor where I had shattered the vial of sedative. The sun was beginning to bleed over the Seoul skyline when the doors finally opened. Hee In-young walked in. He looked exhausted, his tuxedo shirt rumpled, the top buttons undone to reveal the dragon's head. He held the flash drive in his hand. "It was the ledger," he said, his voice flat. "I told you I didn't steal it. I don't even know where you keep it." "It was accessed from the terminal in this room," he countered, walking toward me until I was backed against the window. "3 nights ago, while I was sleeping, while you were tending to my wounds." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, silver locket, the one I wore every day, the one that held the only photo I had of my sister. He flipped it open. Inside, hidden behind the photo, was a microscopic tracking and transmission device. "Jin-ho didn't need you to steal anything, Isabelle," he whispered, his eyes filled with a soul-crushing disappointment. "He just needed you to be near me. This locket has been broadcasting every keystroke, every whispered conversation, every breath I've taken since you arrived. I didn't know. I sobbed, the tears finally breaking through. My father gave me that locket before I came here. He said it was for luck. Hyun-jong laughed, a harsh, broken sound. Your father didn't sell you to settle a debt, Isabelle. He sold you to be a Trojan horse. He took Jinho's money to plant a bug in my bed. He gripped the locket so hard his knuckles turned white. My paranoia didn't destroy this, Isabelle. Your family did. He turned away, heading for the door. Kim is preparing the car. You're leaving. I can't have you in my house, and I can't look at your face without seeing the man who tried to ruin me. Where are you sending me? I asked, cold dread pooling in my stomach. Away, he said, not looking back. If I keep you here, my men will demand your blood for the breach. If I let you go, Jinho will find you. This is the only mercy I have left to give. The doors closed. I was alone in the sunlight, realizing that the dragon hadn't just cast me out. He had broken his own heart to save me from his world. But I knew one thing he didn't. Jinho wouldn't let me just go. I was the only leverage he had left. The weight of the mahogany doors closing felt like a guillotine. In a single night, the third floor had transformed from a sanctuary into a tomb. I stood in the center of the room, still wearing the midnight blue silk gown, now wrinkled and cold against my skin. The dragon had retreated behind his scales, and I was being cast out into a world that was suddenly much more dangerous than his study. The transition was brutal. I wasn't given time to pack or say goodbye to the few staff members who had shown me kindness. Secretary Kim himself escorted me to a nondescript black SUV waiting in the underground garage. He didn't say a word, but the triumphant glint in his eyes told me everything I needed to know. To him, I was a virus that had finally been purged. They drove me for hours, deep into the outskirts of the city, where the neon lights of Seoul faded into the gray mist of the industrial districts. I was dropped off at a small, weathered apartment complex near the docks. The CEO has paid your rent for 6 months, Kim said, handing me a plain envelope and a burner phone. He has also covered the remaining balance for your sister's post-operative care. Consider this your final severance. If you try to contact the estate, or if you are seen within 10 miles of the Ha headquarters, the guards have orders to treat you as an intruder. The door of the SUV slammed shut. I was left standing in the rain, clutching the envelope to my chest. For the first few weeks, I lived like a ghost. I changed my name to Rose, dyed my hair a deep, inconspicuous black, and took a job at a small, bustling shipyard cafe. Every time a black car drove by, my heart stopped. Every time a customer with a sharp jawline walked in, I looked for the dragon ink on a neck that wasn't there. I spent my nights staring at the burner phone, hoping for a message that never came. I knew Hyun-jong's paranoia was a fortress, and I had been the one to accidentally breach the walls. He didn't just think I had betrayed him. He thought the one person he had allowed to touch his face had been a weapon sent by his father's enemies. The pain of that realization was a constant, dull ache in my chest. But as my sister, Maya, began to recover, her voice returning, her strength building, I realized that my severance wasn't just a gift. It was a target. It happened on a Tuesday, during the quiet hour between the lunch and dinner rush. I was wiping down the counters when the bell above the door chimed. I didn't look up immediately. We're closed for another 20 minutes, I said, my voice sounding hollow, even to my own ears. A shame, a voice replied. It was smooth, silk-wrapped gravel. I traveled quite a long way for a cup of coffee and a conversation. I looked up, and the breath left my lungs. It wasn't Hyun-jong. It was Jinho. He looked even more menacing in the dim light of the cafe. He sat at a corner booth, his scarred face twisted into a mock-sympathetic expression. Behind him stood 2 men in gray suits, Director Nam and a silent enforcer. You look well, Isabelle. Or should I call you Rose? Jinho leaned forward, his eyes roaming over my simple work clothes. Hyun-jong was always a fool. He threw away a diamond, because he thought it was a piece of glass. "Leave me alone," I said, my hand instinctively reaching for the kitchen knife hidden under the counter. "The debt is paid. I have nothing left to give you." "On the contrary," Jinho said, standing up and walking toward me. "You are the only thing that can bring the dragon out of his cave. He's become quite the hermit since you left. He's dismantled his security, fired half his board, and he's been making mistakes. Emotional mistakes." He stopped at the counter, his presence cold and suffocating. "Hyunjong might think you're a traitor, but he still dreams about you. And as long as he dreams about you, you are a piece on my board. I won't go with you," I hissed, my sharp, focused gaze locked on his. "You don't have a choice, little maid," Jinho whispered. He held up a tablet. On the screen was a live feed of Maya's recovery room at the clinic. A man in a doctor's coat was standing by her bed, but he wasn't checking her vitals. He was holding a syringe. "She's had such a wonderful recovery," Jinho sneered. "It would be a tragedy if a medical error occurred tonight." The room spun. My father had sold me to settle a debt, but Jinho was stealing my soul to win a war. I realized then that vanishing wasn't enough. I couldn't hide in the shadows anymore. To save Maya, and to save the man who had broken my heart to keep me safe, I had to walk back into the fire. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice as cold as the marble in Hyunjong's study. "I want the dragon's head," Jinho replied, "and you're going to be the one to hand it to me." The neon lights of the shipyard cafe flickered, casting long, sickly shadows across the floor as Jinho's men closed in. I felt the cold metal of the kitchen knife beneath the counter, but I knew it was useless against a man who held my sister's life in a syringe. While I was being pulled into Jinho's shadow, the high estate had become a fortress of silence. Hyunjong sat in his study, the mahogany doors locked from the inside. The monitors that used to scroll with data and security feeds were dark. The only light came from a single desk lamp, casting sharp, angular shadows across his face. He looked thinner, his cheekbones more pronounced, his pale, smooth skin now a ghostly gray. He hadn't slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw my sharp, focused gaze and felt the phantom warmth of my hands on his face. He had spent weeks obsessively re-watching the security footage of the gala, looking for the moment the betrayal happened, only to find himself pausing the frame on my smile instead. "CEO Ha," Secretary Kim's voice crackled through the intercom. "The board is demanding a meeting. Jinho has seized 3 of our shipping routes. We are losing millions every hour. Let them wait," Hyunjong whispered, his voice a hoarse wreck. He picked up the silver locket he had ripped from my neck. He had dismantled the bug inside it, but he couldn't bring himself to throw the piece of jewelry away. He was a dragon who had burned his own nest to root out a spy, only to realize he was shivering in the ashes. Suddenly, his private phone, the one only 3 people in the world had the number to, vibrated on the desk. It wasn't a call. It was a video file. He clicked it. His breath hitched. The video was grainy, taken from a high angle. It showed a desolate warehouse near the docks. In the center of the frame, tied to a wooden chair, was a woman in a simple, stained apron. Her black hair was messy, her rich, deep brown skin smudged with dirt, but her eyes, those defiant, piercing eyes, were unmistakable. "Hyunjong," Jinho's voice came from behind the camera. "You always said she was just a contract, a solution to a debt. If that's true, you won't mind if I terminate the agreement." The camera panned to the side, showing a digital clock counting down. 60 minutes. "Come alone to Pier 42, Jinho sneered, "or I'll send her back to you in pieces, just like you did to my brother." Hyunjong stood up so abruptly his chair hit the floor. The lethargy that had consumed him for weeks vanished, replaced by a cold, predatory focus. He didn't call Kim. He didn't alert the guards. He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a heavy black pistol, checking the magazine with a practiced, lethal click. He threw on his black suit jacket, the dragon tattoos on his neck seeming to pulse with a life of their own. He knew it was a trap. He knew that walking into Pier 42 alone was a suicide mission. But as he looked at the frozen image of my face on the screen, he realized he didn't care about the throne or the syndicate. For the first time in his life, the Mafia CEO wasn't acting for power. He was acting for the woman who had dared to tell him he was human. Outside, the rain began to fall again, a torrential downpour that blurred the lines between the city and the sea. Hyun Jong climbed into his fastest car, the engine roaring like a beast awoken from a long slumber. At the warehouse, I sat in the dark, the ropes cutting into my wrists. I could hear the waves crashing against the pier outside. Jin-ho stood by the window, checking his watch. He won't come? I whisper, my voice raspy. He thinks I betrayed him. He hates me. Jin-ho turned, his scarred face illuminated by a flash of lightning. You don't understand men like us, Isabelle. He doesn't hate you. He hates how much he needs you. And that is exactly why he's going to die tonight. A distant screech of tires echoed through the salt air. The dragon had arrived. The sound of the heavy warehouse doors sliding open was like a thunderclap, echoing through the hollow, salt-crusted space. A silhouette stood against the torrential rain, the flickering yellow streetlights behind him catching the sharp angles of his face and the dark, wet ink of the dragon on his neck. Hyun Jong didn't run. He walked with a slow, terrifying precision, his footsteps heavy on the damp concrete. He was alone, just as Jin-ho had demanded, his black suit soaked through, clinging to the scars I had once traced with my fingertips. Stop right there, ha! Jin-ho shouted, his voice cracking with a manic edge. He stepped behind my chair, grabbing a handful of my hair and tilting my head back. He pressed a cold, serrated blade against my throat. One more step, and the Maid's story ends here. Hyun-jong halted. His dark brown eyes, usually so calculated, were wide, showing that flicker of fear I had seen the night I grabbed his face. But this time, the fear wasn't for himself. Let her go, Jin-ho, Hyun Jong said, his voice a low, vibrating growl. You wanted the dragon. I'm standing right here. She has nothing to do with this. She has everything to do with this. Jin-ho screamed, his grip tightening. You dismantled your board for her. You ignored the syndicate for her. You became weak because of a girl who doesn't even belong in our world. I looked at Hyun Jong, my vision blurring with tears. Hyun Jong go, it's a trap. There are snipers in the rafters. He didn't look up at the shadows. He didn't reach for the gun tucked into his waistband. He kept his eyes locked on mine, a silent apology written in their depths. I spent my life thinking touch was a weakness, Hyun Jong said, his voice remarkably steady. I thought the scars made me a monster. But she was the only one who looked at the scars and saw a man. He slowly raised his hands, palms open. Then, with a deliberate motion, he reached back and pulled the pistol from his belt, dropping it onto the concrete. It clattered, the sound ringing out like a death knell. The ledger you stole, the offshore accounts. I've already signed the transfers, Hyun Jong said. The Haas syndicate is empty. I've burned it all down. Take the money. Take the throne. Just let her walk out of here. Jin-ho stared at him, momentarily stunned by the sheer scale of the surrender. The most powerful man in Seoul had just committed professional suicide for a maid. You're insane, Jin-ho whispered. You'd give it all up? For her. In a heartbeat, Hyun Jong replied. Greed finally overcame Jin-ho's bloodlust. He shoved me forward, the chair toppling over as I sprawled onto the wet floor. Get out, before I change my mind. I scrambled to my feet, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Hyun Jong, come on. But as I reached for him, a red laser appeared on the center of Hyun Jong's chest. The snipers hadn't been told about a peaceful trade. Run, Isabelle! Hyun-jong roared. A shot rang out, muffled by the rain. I screamed as Hyun Jong was thrown backward, the force of the bullet catching him in the shoulder. The same shoulder I had bandaged only weeks before. Jin-ho laughed, reaching for his own weapon, but he had underestimated a dragon who had nothing left to lose. Despite the blood blooming on his shirt, Hyun Jong lunged. He didn't use a gun. He used the raw, violent strength he had honed in the pits of his father's basement. I watched in horror and awe as the two titans collided in the dark. It wasn't a clean fight. It was a desperate, bloody struggle for survival. Hyun-jong fought like a man possessed, his movements fueled by a singular, burning need to ensure I made it to the door. With a final, guttural shout, Hyun-jong sent Jinho crashing into a stack of heavy shipping crates. The rival leader slumped, unconscious or worse, as the sirens of the police, called by Secretary Kim in a final, unexpected act of loyalty, wailed in the distance. Hyun-jong fell to his knees, clutching his shoulder. The dragon on his neck was stained with a new layer of red. I ran to him, sliding on the concrete, and pulled his head into my lap. "You're okay," I sobbed, my hands trembling as I pressed them against the wound. "You're going to be okay." He looked up at me, a faint, pained smile touching his pink lips. He reached up, his blood-stained fingers shaking as they brushed my cheek. "I told you," he whispered, his voice fading. "No one touches the dragon, unless I tell them to." The rain began to wash away the salt and the blood as the sirens grew louder, their blue and red lights reflecting off the oily puddles on the concrete. The warehouse, once a place of terror, felt suddenly quiet, a stage where the play had finally ended. 1 month later, the world was different. The Haas syndicate had not just fallen, it had been surgically dismantled. The newspapers were full of stories about the Dragon of Seoul stepping down, liquidating his assets, and turning over evidence that crippled the city's underworld. To the public, he was a mystery. To me, he was just a man recovering in a quiet clinic on the coast. I stood in the doorway of a small, sun-drenched room overlooking the ocean. The scent of salt water and lilies filled the air. Maya was there, sitting at the foot of a bed, her laughter ringing out as she showed off her latest sketches. She was healthy, her cheeks full of color, her life no longer a bargaining chip. On the bed sat Hyun-jong. He was wearing a simple white linen shirt, the top buttons open. The dragon tattoo on his neck was still there, but the tension in his jaw had vanished. He looked at Maya with a soft, genuine interest that I never thought a man like him could possess. When he saw me, he went still. Maya, sensing the shift, gave my hand a squeeze and slipped out of the room, leaving us alone with the sound of the crashing waves. "I didn't think you'd come today," he said, his voice stronger now, though it still held that low, velvet vibration. "I wanted to see if the flowers I sent were still alive," I replied, walking toward him. I stopped a few feet away, the space between us filled with the ghosts of everything we had survived. Hyun-jong stood up slowly, his movement still a bit stiff from the wound in his shoulder. He didn't close the distance. He waited, giving me the choice he had once denied me. "The syndicate is gone, Isabelle," he said softly. "The money is in a trust for the clinic and the city's orphanages. There is no more debt, no more contracts, no more dragon. And what's left?" I asked. He looked down at his hands, then back at me. A man with too many scars and a lot of time to make things right. "I'm not asking for your trust today. I know I destroyed that when I let my paranoia win. I'm just asking for a chance to earn it back." He reached into his bedside drawer and pulled out the silver locket. He had repaired the hinge, and the photo of Maya was back in its place. He held it out to me, his hands steady. "I don't want to be your master, and I don't want to be your savior," he whispered. "I just want to be the man who gets to see those loud eyes of yours every morning." I looked at the locket, then at the man who had traded an empire for my safety. I reached out, my fingers brushing against his as I took the jewelry. The touch didn't spark fear or anger. It felt like coming home. I didn't put the locket on. Instead, I stepped forward and did the one thing that had started it all. I reached up and placed my hand on his face. Hyun-jong's eyes fluttered shut, a long, shaky breath escaping his lips as he leaned into my palm. He didn't flinch. He didn't pull away. He just stood there, letting me see him, truly see him, without the ink or the armor. "The flowers are still alive," I said, a small smile finally breaking through. But they need a lot of care. I have all the time in the world, he replied, covering my hand with his own. Outside, the sun was beginning to set over the East Sea, painting the sky in shades of gold and violet. The debt was paid, the war was over, and for the first time in both our lives, the future wasn't something to be feared. It was something to be built, one touch at a time.